WTS 5066. If you can go to page 12, please, Mr. Clerk. Okay, so this is a topic, Mr. Stewart, that we canvassed fairly in depth at your interview. And you're starting here, I think, from the very initial reaction of the OPS to the protests. And you say from the beginning, well, you're actually conveying Commissioner Lucky's words here, or her views. She reported that from the beginning, the OPS were on their heels. The volume of people exceeded their ability to do policing, and they made a mistake in allowing trucks to come into the downtown core and park on the street. Commissioner Lucky also reported that the NCRCC was not working particularly well because there were personality issues involved. Deputy Minister Stewart explained that he got the sense that as time went on, the OPS pulled it together and the OPP got involved. So I'll just stop there and ask you to describe in general terms what you were hearing about the OPS response and what views you formed about it.
My understanding, both firsthand in conversations with Chief Slowly and second or third hand through the Commissioner of the RCMP, was that the situation having come to where it was, in other words, an embedded protest that had formed a perimeter, in essence, that was hard to enter and to do any enforcement within, that there was some considerable debate behind the scenes as to what the strategy would be for enforcement, and kind of a chicken and egg situation where the various police forces involved, and here I'm not just referring to the OPP and the RCMP, but also other Ontario police who ultimately came to Ottawa to assist, were waiting for a clear a plan of action before they mobilized the vast amount of police officers that ultimately came to the city to take action. And that plan, in the early going was very fragmentary in the sense that it involved some enforcement actions, but it wasn't a take down the protest plan. And the formulation of the take down the protest plan took time. In general, I think there were differences, as far as I could tell, of a view about what the right strategy would be. And it took a couple of weeks before the right chemistry in behind the scenes in the integrated command center was attained. That was my impression.
Okay, and if we can just scroll down a little bit here to page 13. Paragraph 3, so just scroll down a little bit. So here you're adding, it was difficult to get people to come to an agreement about a plan because there were personality issues in the mix. And then you go on to talk about that. So that probably refers to what you were just saying about chemistry at the RCC. Can you elaborate a little bit on the personality issues that you were hearing about?
Not really. I mean, this, in a sense, what I said before is probably the main substance of this and what I knew and understood. And I would not want to lay this at the door of Chief Slowly, to be honest with you. I was hearing that he was very involved and that it was difficult, partly because everybody was stretched so thin to get to a landing zone on a plan, and maybe others as other tools. But we, in part going back to comments made by my colleague, weren't monitoring other than through open source what was going on. So we would not have felt, we did not feel well equipped to understand what plans were, and yet things were happening. So that's the genesis of that comment, and also just to flag that we were sensing that this was nationwide because convoys were happening across the country.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about that, keeping in mind that we're going to be hearing directly from CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency, and from Transport Canada, who will have a lot to say about the specifics of what was going on at various ports of entry and places across the country. Would you be able to give us a sort of a high-level overview of what you were seeing and what you were being informed about around this time across the country?
Well, there was quite a list, actually. I'd have a hard time itemizing it, but there were the principal places in which disruption was occurring were Windsor, of course, and that happened well after Coutts started being blockaded. Shortly after Coutts started, we had Emerson in the province of Manitoba, and slow roll and highway blocking protests near the Blue Water Bridge in Ontario, near the Peace Bridge in Niagara, and some sense that something could happen in Cornwall. Later on in British Columbia, we had the Pacific Highway convoy. So those would be the principal ones. Every day in our calls with ministers, CBSA would be reporting across a whole set of ports of entry what they were observing, and they had taken steps to better equip themselves to see what was going on and to talk to local police authorities to see if it could be managed, that if a trucking or a convoy manifested itself, it could be directed away from the port of entry and couldn't install itself in the port or on the bridge or whatever the case may be.
Okay. So essentially, as you've said, you in your position as DM Public Safety were looking at not just what was happening in Ottawa, but what was happening across the country. And
yes, the federal government was as a group. We were all conscious that this was not something which was limited to Ottawa. Ottawa is the most extreme example. But the general impression we had was that what had begun as a protest about vaccine mandates had become something more than that, and was attracting various people from with various issues and causes, and had become a kind of a popular thing. And we were seeing it in other countries, by the way, too.
can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, there were convoys in New Zealand with Canada flags, which were just essentially emulating the protests.
That was happening in Canada?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's go to now the February 10th minutes. So this is SSM NSC CAN 50209. So these are now minutes from a different cabinet committee called the Incident Response Group. And we will be hearing from PCO later in the week and the details of what that is and how that transpired. But again, can you just give us a very brief definition of what the Incident Response Group is?
Well, to begin with, I wouldn't call it a cabinet committee as such.
Fair enough.
Cabinet committees in the normal course are standing committees to deal with various, policy and.
So there again, on February 3rd, CSIS assessed there's no indications of known IMVE actors were planning to engage in violence. And it's on February 13th, I believe that this is the document that Director Vigneault is referring to, that states that, it could have been a risk if you invoke the Emergencies Act to making things worse. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And you knew about that?
I did.
Right, and so did Cabinet. They knew about all of this, correct?
Yes.
Right. Okay, if I could bring up the next document, which is going to be TSNSC.CAN.001.000000160. _REL_0001. Now, before I get into this, you can agree that it was clear to both you and Cabinet that CSIS did not have reasonable suspicion that there existed a Section 2 CSIS Act threat during the protest. Is that correct?
Was clear to me, and I believe it was clear to ministers.
Right.
I can't say with authority, however.
And I also understand that the Canadian Security Establishment, the CSE, they never advised you or the government or cabinet that they had identified a Section 2 CSIS Act threat either. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
Right. And both the RCMP and the OPP, from at least their evidence and things we've seen to date, they never identified or advised the government that there was a Section 2 CSIS Act threat, right?
To the best of my knowledge, no.
Right. And so the entire intelligence apparatus and law enforcement apparatus within Canada tells the cabinet and the government that there is no Section 2 CSIS Act threat. Is that right?
No, that is not right. CSIS, and Director Vigneault will be here to speak for himself. CSIS assessed according to their standards under their act. Nobody else was assessing under the standards under the CSIS Act. You asked me, did they tell anybody it had met a standard? They wouldn't use the CSIS Act. That wouldn't be their tool. They would be looking at broader national security issues.
Okay, so what intelligence bureau or agency or law enforcement agency told the government, here's the evidence of reasonable and probable grounds, or reasonable grounds, of a Section 2 CSIS Act threat? And you know, I take it now, because it's advised to you, that that's required to invoke the Emergencies Act. It's in the documents. You were advised of that.
Yes.
Right. So what agency gave you the evidence and the intelligence that said, hey, we have reasonable grounds of a Section 2 CSIS Act threat? There wasn't one, was there?
It is your colleague, Martin Loken, who's the Deputy Head of Mission, Foreign Policy and National Security at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. And he's writing to Jody Thomas, whom we've heard as the National Security Advisor. And he says at the bottom here, concern about Ottawa's situation now overshadowed by the blocked Ambassador Bridge and supply chain disruptions to Detroit. There is a sense Canada is not devoting enough resources, human or otherwise, to dislodge the truckers. So is that an example of what you were just telling us about?
Yes.
That sentiment? And that's something that Mr. Logan was hearing and you were hearing as well?
Yes, we were hearing that directly from the White House. He was, and I was getting it locally in our territory, my territory.
Okay, and Mr. Morseison, you were hearing that as well?
That's right. We were also hearing that directly from the United States Embassy here in Ottawa. And then also there were a number of conversations at the ministerial level between various departments where similar concerns were being conveyed.
Okay. Then if we can just turn up SSM CAN 50442.
And so under international law, we have a particular responsibility to ensure the safety and security of diplomats. And so it was that broader context that we were concerned about.
Would you say that Canada was unable to fulfill its obligations under the convention during this time?
I think it's fair to say that we were concerned that we would be unable to fulfill our responsibilities. And I think as the convoy went on longer, and there were more and more stories about assaults on the street, about unlawful conduct and unwillingness to comply with injunctions and so on, that concern just continued to rise over time.
So I'd like to switch to a different topic, which is the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So when did you become aware that it would be invoked?
I became aware of when it would be invoked. I think it was the day of.
Okay. So was GAC providing any input on that or advice to invoke it, that kind of thing?
So the input that we provided was through a number of different channels. So it was, first of all, through these DMOC committees. Each day we would do a tour de table and provide inputs from various departments' perspectives and share information. So each day I would provide inputs on what we were hearing from diplomatic missions, what we were hearing from trading partners, from businesses, and so on. So that was one channel. We also provided reporting into the Privy Council office on issues under Global Affairs Canada's mandate. And then we also provided information where appropriate to the Government Operations Centre. So for instance, our rapid response mechanism, which is referred to in some of our documents, provided its input through the Government Operations Centre. So in answer to your question, yes, we were providing input in through various channels that may have informed the decision-making.
Since you mentioned RRM Canada, I actually had some questions about that.
Okay.
So could you just explain what that is in general terms?
Sure. So RRM stands for the Rapid Response Mechanism. So this was something that was agreed to at the G7 leaders meeting in 2018 in Charlevoix when Canada was the host. And the mandate of the RRM was really to identify and respond to threats from foreign state actors on G7 democracies. And we were particularly focused on threats oriented towards democratic institutions and processes, towards threats towards our media and our social media and online environment, and then also threats to the exercise of human rights and freedoms. So this was really, I want to stress, about foreign state actor threats to our democracy.
So I understand that RRM Canada produced several reports during this period. I'd like to pull one up. It's SSM NSC CAN 50169. This is from February 14th. If we look at the key findings, the first one says RRM Canada has not seen evidence of significant foreign state-sponsored involvement in the online information space to date. So were you seeing these reports at the time? Or?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. And was this, when they speak of significant foreign state-sponsored involvement, can you expand on that? I think you've touched on it already. What were they looking for?
So because the mandate of the RRM is to really focus on foreign state-sponsored threats to democracy, that's really what the RRM looks like. So, looks at. So the RRM uses tools that would be publicly available to do analysis of social media. And its focus is really on identifying, are there foreign state actors that are introducing disinformation? Are they amplifying certain messages in order to mislead or deceive, et cetera?
And were these reports shared with other departments during this time as well?
Yes, so these reports were fed into the Government Operations Center. And while I didn't share these reports in their entirety with DMOC, I did provide some of the sort of top-line messaging from time to time at DMOC meetings.
Okay. So I'd like to return to just another few questions about the Emergencies Act itself. And just when we looked at the Section 58 explanation before, it talks about the adverse effects on trade corridors, international border crossings, and Canada's relationship with its trading partners. Can you comment on how the measures were designed to address those concerns?
I wasn't really involved in the design of the measures, so I don't really think I can speak to that question unless I'm misunderstanding your
No, that's
question.
okay. How did they affect the concerns, I suppose? Were they effective in the end, these measures?
So, and again, maybe Mr. Comartin will have additional points to add, but I would say that the response from many of our, particularly U.S. interlocutors, was a sense of relief. After those measures had been invoked, the concerns about particularly the economic blockades at border crossings, and not just the Ambassador Bridge, but it was Emerson, it was Coots, it was the border crossing near Surrey in BC, and then concerns that some of these would reoccur. And so I think the sense of relief was palpable amongst many of our interlocutors in the United States at both the political level, also the business associations, and amongst unions.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. Comartin? Like, did you hear from stakeholders?
Not so much at that immediate period of time, but subsequently over the next few weeks, even few months. The same point that my colleague has raised of that sense of relief and I think a conviction that Canada was not prepared to let this happen again to the extent that they would move to invoke that type of legislation. So
And
that messaging was fairly clear, but it sort of drifted in over a period of time. It wasn't immediate.
And did the measures ultimately resolve the concerns that missions in Ottawa had as well?
Yes, I mean, I think with following the invocation of the Emergency Act and the enforcement action that happened, the convoy protests were cleared and missions could go about their usual business, and our concerns about being able to uphold our responsibilities under the Vienna Convention were allayed.
So I think I'm just about at a
Correct?
I would say that Global Affairs Canada was particularly interested in the border crossings and the economic blockades that were happening there, but also in the convoy protests here in Ottawa, given the concerns we had with respect to diplomatic missions in the downtown core.
Right. And I take it that, at least from viewing some of the records, et cetera, that the concern with the diplomatic missions was not that the protest was interfering with the missions, but that it inconvenienced some of the diplomats. Is that fair?
No, I wouldn't agree with that characterization. It wasn't just a matter of inconvenience. As I mentioned to Commission Council, the Government of Canada has an obligation under the Vienna Convention to ensure the safety and security of diplomats here in Canada, and to ensure that they are enabled to carry out their functions without undue difficulty. So we were concerned about being able to fulfill that obligation. And I think given the context in the downtown core, the concern was more than one of just inconvenience.
Right. And it's fair to say that not a single diplomat from a foreign state was physically assaulted by a protester, correct?
I am not aware of physical assaults, but we were always concerned about that possibility given the reports that we had heard of quite a number of physical assaults during that period.
Well, this commission has heard evidence with respect to physical assaults during the period of the protest that there was a total of 5 charges in total. So that's from the beginning of the protest until the end. And I understand your concern, but you have no evidence that any diplomat was physically assaulted by any of the protesters in Ottawa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. And I also understand that you have no evidence that any of the protesters in downtown Ottawa verbally threatened to harm any of the diplomats. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it was always a concern that that might happen, and hence our concern about being able to live up to our Vienna Convention obligations.
Right. And it's not like a situation, for example, in 1970 during the FLQ crisis where a diplomat was murdered and another one kidnapped, where they actually invoked the War Measures Act. That wasn't it. You were concerned about maybe someone might threaten a diplomat.
We were concerned about being able to comply with our international legal obligations.
Under the Vienna Convention.
Correct.
Right. Okay. And I take it with respect to just turning your mind now to the border blockades, the information that you have, you said there was no actual report done with respect to the.
Folks, if you want to keep up to date on what's happening at the Emergency Act inquiry, including my live tweets and some clips and highlights that occurring at the Emergency Act inquiry, by heading over to revolutionnews.ca, Emergency Act Commission. That's revolutionnews.ca/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, here folks, while you're there, please head over to donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. That's donorbox.org/Emergency Act Commission. And of course, here folks, if you could chip in a buck or two, that will be greatly appreciated, as it will help me cover my travel expenses, including my expenses on food, as bringing you these stories doesn't come for free. Thank you so much.